To wrap up the discussion of design patterns, the plan and document perspective on design patterns. What would plan and document say about the idea of design patterns? And is it easier to sort of use them in a plan and document approach or in sort of agile? Plan and documents approach sort of with careful planning and extensive documentation, you might sort of say some of this design we do up front, and that might reveal early on in an application that if you know the needs and you can spec them out, that certain design patterns would be useful. That in that design phase of your application, you should explicitly be considering the design patterns that you might use. If you're using something like a software requirement specification, this should suggest what classes you need and what the interface between those classes might be, such that you can leverage a particular design pattern. And for each task, there may be one or more sort of clear design patterns. People sort of critique Agile, right? That it encourages you to start coding without any design. But in reality, this doesn't need to be the case. You don't have to start code without thinking about the design. And in particular, in plan and document, you might not know how the design will evolve until you start implementing code. So where Agile perhaps shines with design patterns is when you start having an implementation that needs to change, you think about constantly and deliberately refactoring your code to take advantage of design patterns that make sense for the problems that you're trying to solve. Is that when you start coding and when you realize the design will need to change, you then make a deliberate point of refactoring your code. How much design should you do up front? This is always the question, right? How much in an agile world do you plan for? And the general advice is that if you've previously done a project where you've seen some design constraint or element before, that it's okay to plan in your current project to implement design patterns before you explicitly know that you're going to need them. If you anticipate perhaps changing authentication providers or using multiple single sign-on systems like Google and GitHub, it makes sense to reach for those design patterns. In your SaaS app, right, you might plan for different kinds of storage needs and different kinds of databases because you know that your test database and your development database and your production database may be different. You may perhaps think about how you might need to scale the app early on to prepare yourself for those challenges, if you're lucky enough to have them. Chapter 12 of the book will talk about scaling and the various ways of doing DevOps. But the idea with Agile is that you should consider your needs, but you don't necessarily need to plan for every single use case. Patterns tend to be a little bit more abstract. Some of them aren't always targeted to a particular domain or language. So not every design pattern in the Gang of Four book directly applies to Ruby on Rails, but most of them have ideas that we can leverage. And in particular, the ones that we've covered tend to apply pretty well. Frameworks are a great way to sort of think through the different types of problems that can happen in an application.